Could I please ask you to take a seat? Welcome back, everyone. Sorry, it's not working at all. It is now working. So I've just shocked you out. Welcome back, everyone, for the first session this afternoon. Please take your seats, and so we can get going. My name is Silvianne Aspray. I'm a postdoc at the Faculty of Divinity here, and I'm delighted to chair this panel entitled Apophasis and Entanglement with Professor Olivier Boulnois and Dr. Simone Kotva. Professor Boulnois, our first speaker, is Directeur d'études at the École pratique des hautes études in Paris, holding a chair for medieval philosophy and metaphysics. His research focuses on the history of Western metaphysics and ethics. And some of you may know his excellent book called Metaphysics rebelle. That's the one that, to me, stands out among your many books. Professor Boulnois' paper is entitled Towards a Trinitarian Negative Theology. Please join me in welcoming Professor Boulnois.
Do you hear me at the back? Yeah. I had to run because I got lost, but unfortunately I found my way. How can we get a rigorous knowledge of the Trinity? To approach the mystery, we have no other means than our language. But we must be careful. How are we sure that our words are not an obstacle between us and the object we try to reach? In order to recognize the absolute originality and the transcendence of what we are aiming at, we must criticize the limits of our language. This is the goal of negative theology. Now, we may have forgotten it, but that is what Trinitarian theology was all about in the beginning, as John Milbank reminded us. That is at least what I would like to show in my paper. For this demonstration, it would be tempting to use the most negative theologians, for example, Dionysius Areopagita, or even more, Gregory of Nyssa, but it would be too easy. I would like, on the contrary, to study an author who is precisely the origin of Western Trinitarian speculation and the source of theology as a science, Augustine. I would like to show that his De Trinitate and some other texts contains very specific warnings, encouraging us to make a critical reading of the concepts used in Trinitarian theology, a true negative Trinitarian theology. But I will also ask if Augustine has always been faithful to his own principles, and if we couldn't go even further than Augustine in this negative way. But first and foremost, I must admit that my title is slightly misleading. I have used the modern phrase negative theology, but the proper phrase would be theology of transcendence. The phrase negative theology is not found in Dionysius. It has been coined by the first Greek copyists and glossators, and Eriugena has transformed it into a methodological concept. Indeed, what Dionysius displays is a theology of transcendence. The divine names refer to God through affirmation and negation, but also beyond them, since God is infinitely beyond our names, and even beyond our human-to-human negation of these names. God is not good as the created things are good. Neither is he not good. He is infinitely beyond the good and the not good. The recognition of this excess is called by Dionysius eminence, hyperarchy. Therefore, the Dionysian theology of divine names should not be called a negative theology, but a theology of eminence or transcendence. It is not a refusal to speak. And I think this is the case for all rigorous and critical language that wants to respect the transcendence of its object, namely God. In the longer and written version of my paper, I have shown that the Western Trinitarian theology has united the core of Trinitarian thought with the highest degree of metaphysics. It has transformed the first impulses of Augustine and ended with the Hegelian system, which Heidegger calls an onto-theology. Maybe Dr. Husserl will show that too. If we agree with the idea that such a metaphysical interpretation is the doom of Trinity, does it mean that, with Augustine, the worm was in the fruit? I would answer no and yes. No, because Augustine himself has multiplied his methodological warnings. And yes, because in a few decisive points, he has forgotten to follow them. First, let us begin with the method he claims to follow. When it deals with the Trinity, Augustine's method is no less negative than Dionysius' method. It is differently so. I will recall first what he says in general about the method we should follow, and second, 3 methodic rules he presents in the De Trinitate, and in each case, I will check if he respects his own rules. So my first point. Concerning the general method, Augustine explains in Sermon 52 why our language is limited. First, we cannot experience God. When the mind tries to ascend by itself to the triune God, it is a form of presumption because we have no experience of Him. We have access to Him only through Scripture. Second, we cannot say God. Even in the Scripture, where He is given to us, says Augustine, God, which we try to understand, quotation, should be understood as ineffable. Let the words stop. Let the tongues be silent. End of quotation. Third, we cannot understand Him. Quotation, if you understand what you want to say, it is not God. If you could understand, you understood something else instead of God. Therefore, He is not what you understood, and what He is, you did not understand. End of quotation. However, we must speak and strive to approach what we cannot understand. All these negations are about our words and our thought. They are not negations of God. On the contrary, they are a way to recognize that God transcends not only our experience and our words, but also our concepts abstracted from our experience. Therefore, they liberate God's divinity from all our idolatrous phantasms, images, and concepts. If we cannot say what God is, at least we must not think what He is not. Quotation, whoever thus thinks of God, although he cannot yet find out in all ways what He is, quits it, yet piously takes heed, as much as he is able, to think nothing of Him that He is not. Quid nunc. De Trinitate 5:1-2. Our negative use of language serves to clear the way. Therefore, in the De Trinitate 1:1-1, Augustine mentions 3 erroneous methods we have to overcome, corresponding to the 3 degrees of being, the corporeal, the incorporeal, and the divine. First degree of error, some persons transfer to the incorporeal world what they have learned through the senses. They try to represent the invisible with the visible, but, I quote, he who thinks God is red or white is in error. Second degree, some people think God according to their incorporeal mind and its affections. They project psychological images into Him. Third, some want to transcend all the creatures, even incorporeal. But since they lack humility, they cannot do what they want. They cannot reach God through their knowledge. I quote their overbold affirmation, end of quotation, is a form of Pelagianism. It makes them, quotation, it makes them unable to correct their own opinion when it is perverse. So, I come to my second point. These three errors lead us to the rules we must follow when we read the scripture. We cannot give faith to it without converting our presumption into humility, 1:1-2. But precisely because it is suited to the humble, the language of the Bible corresponds to the first two degrees. The divine names are transferred from the body or from our images of spiritual creatures. The main exception is the divine name of the Exodus 3:14, I am that I am, which is a biblical name that transcends not only corporeal images, but also spiritual forms. This is where the Augustinian way departs from the Dionysian. For Augustine, the highest degree of creatures, the nearest to God, is the incorporeal spirit. But the only experience we have of these spirits is our mind. In order to think God, we must thus eliminate all properties that cannot be attributed to the soul. We must get into our mind and find there that God is even higher. I quote, "What we do not find in that which is our own best, we ought not to seek in him who is far better than that best of ours." De Trinitate 5:1-2. This is the core of the Anselmian name of God, Quo maius cogitari nequit, which is already used by Augustine. Here comes the first rule of Trinitarian theology. It must remain negative. It must reject not only the phantasms of bodies, not only the forms of the mind, but also the Aristotelian categories of being. There, Augustine follows a list of 10 categories, analogous to the categoriae decem, once attributed to Augustine himself, in order to exclude 9 of them from God's nomination. I quote, it's in De Trinitate 5:1-2. So we may understand God as good without quantity, great without quality, creator without dependency, sine indigentia creator, etc. Here, 2 points must be highlighted. First, according to this rule, the category of the relative is excluded. Second, the category of substance is admitted as an exception. The first point is implied by the very fact that Augustine excludes 9 categories. It is also implied by the phrase sine indigentia, without dependency, which alludes to relatives because the relation between God and creature could lead to a mutual dependency. It is finally implied by the parallel text of Confessions 5:7-8. The second point is well known. Without any transition or justification, Augustine admits that God can be called positively a substance. Est tamen sine dubitatione substantia. He is, however, without doubt, a substance, 5:2-3. This so-called evidence is obtained through Augustine's own exegesis of the name of God, I am that I am, quoted precisely there. However, Augustine remains careful when he applies the concept of substance to God. We should use a better word, essentia, essence, rather than substantia. This is rooted in the conceptual meaning of substance. The concept evokes the idea of a subject changed by its accident. But in God, I quote, there can be no accident nor change. However, the concept of essence essentia comes from the concept of being, esse. And since being at its highest degree belongs to God, we must call him an essence. And God is the highest degree of being because he is not only incorporeal as our mind, but also unchangeable. Here, Augustine is clearly making a concession to the Aristotelian definition of metaphysics. According to Metaphysics Epsilon, quoted later by Boethius in his De Trinitate, the object of the Theologica Episteme, theological science, is what is separate from the bodies and not subject to change. Thus, God is considered already by Augustine as the supreme being, is qui summe est, a concept that has an immense posterity from Anselm to Suarez. So, precisely when he believes to follow the authority of the Bible, Augustine surrenders to metaphysics. And once the breakthrough has been made, we should not be surprised to see another category move into it, the relative, which is used by Augustine in order to explain how the persons of the Trinity relate to each other. I quote, "Whereas some things severally are specially predicated, either in mutual reference or in respect to creature, such things are spoken relatively, not in the way of substance." What is more surprising is the fact that thus he violates his own prohibition on the 9 categories other than substance. After denying that among the categories of being, the relative names may be used to describe God's nature, he comes here to a complete reversal and admits them without any other justification than their conceptual efficiency. Hence, Augustine tries to reconstruct a rational conception of the Trinity with the 2 main categories of being, substance and relatives. By doing so, he follows a Neoplatonic trend. A century later, a pagan philosopher, Simplicius, elaborated a theory of transcendental relations applied to everything, including the divine. So, in the case of substance and relation, Augustine breaks the rules of his own rigorous and negative method. He yields to the immense power of metaphysics. And this combination of essence and relation will give way to the ontological self-relationship and self-alienation we find in Hegel. But there is a second contradiction in Augustine's Trinitarian theology. In Book 6, Augustine states a second rule, that God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit does not make 3. I quote, "Neither, since he is a Trinity, is he therefore to be thought triple, triplex." But instead of following the ultimate consequences of this remark, namely that the Trinity is beyond all number, he asks in Book 7, "Quoniam tres sunt, quaeramus quid tres sint, et quid commune habeant." Seeing that there are 3, let us ask what these 3 are and what they have in common. It's in 747. Thus, Augustine is able to go back from the question, what are these things, quid tria sint, to the question, what thing are these 3, quid tres sint, 747. But he bypasses the most fundamental question, who are they? Therefore, he slips to what they have in common. For example, the name persona. Thus, Augustine neglects the fact that the 3 are disparate, absolutely different, and that they do not make a number and do not fall under a universal. And finally, there is a third contradiction between Augustine's negative rules and his conclusions. As he explains in Sermon 52, in order to think the divine Trinity, he looked among creatures for 3 things that are named separately but act inseparably. He has discovered that such an image of the Trinity could be found only in what is nearest to God, in the interior man as an image of God. There, we find 3 faculties that can be considered separately and that act indivisibly: memory, intellect, and will. This is the origin of the psychological model of the Trinity. But in the sermon, Augustine stops there. For him, I quote, "It is enough. It is enough to have proved that these 3 faculties are said separately and act together. They reflect the 3 persons of the Trinity who are said separately and who act together. This is obviously a proof of the compatibility of unity and Trinity on the level of the mind and a fortiori on the level of the divine. But we should not go further." Quotation, "I do not say that the memory represents the Father, the intellect the Son, and the will the Holy Spirit. I do not say that. Whatever meaning you give to it, I don't dare." End of quotation. Why? Obviously, because it is improper to transfer a concept describing the mind in the second degree of being to God in the highest degree of being. So, according to this sermon, the triple constitution of the mind is only an analogy to God's nature. There is no direct resemblance between each faculty of our mind and each person of the Trinity. We should stop at that negative statement. But clearly, Augustine does the contrary in the De Trinitate. In this treatise, each of these faculties is an image of a person. The memory is the image of the Father, the intellect of the Son, the will of the Holy Spirit. So, very strangely, he does precisely what the sermon says he would not do. And this sermon means that he was the first one to perceive the dangers of his own method. Of course, the reason for this precaution is that such an explanation should be reserved, I quote, for those who would understand more. And he broke this rule because the De Trinitate was written for these greater minds. But can we ignore such a warning? Should not this rule remain valid for these minds? Should the principle of humility be forgotten? Should not our language respect its own limits? The rest of the story shows that once the negative dimension of all knowledge of God is forgotten, Trinitarian thought begins to be secularized. I have mentioned the long-term consequences of this psychological turn. With Hegel and Feuerbach, we get to an onto-theo-psychological metaphysics, where the transcendence of God vanishes and where the essence of divinity is accomplished through the essence of man in history. So Augustine is a thinker of extraordinary lucidity. He knows the dangers of the Aristotelian categories of being, the dangers of the numbering of persons in God, the dangers of the application of psychological models to God. But carried away by the power of metaphysics, he could not resist it. In my beginning is my end. This famous verse of T.S. Eliot might be our motto. In the beginning of the Western theology of the Trinity, we can see with the utmost transparency the fate of this science. It is a double fate, since we find in Augustine the parting of two ways. On one side, Augustine insists vigorously on the necessity of a negative use of the language when we deal with divine Trinity. On the other side, he introduces some of the most metaphysical characters of Trinitarian theology, the categories of being through essence and relatives, the numbering of the persons, the psychological images. So, in the beginning of this science, we see its end, the resorption of divine transcendence, the Trinity reduced to a combination of being and relation, the alienation of the divine in human psychology. But this other side reflects only the content of his theology. Concerning the method, Augustine stated fundamental principles. Even if he did not always respect them, he multiplied his warnings, and they are still a reminder for us. To recall that is not to confine Trinitarian theology to a lost paradise of primitive biblical thought. We must remind that exactly at the same time, Cyril of Alexandria described the Trinity as a paradox, characterized by its transcendence. He emphasizes that human concepts must enter into crisis and be corrected by their opposites. We must multiply partial approaches of the Trinity without giving in to the temptation to rationalize its fundamental contradictions. And we must not forget that our object is paradoxical. We are trying to cope with the contradiction of multiplicity and unity. If we forget that in the famous phrase, mia ousia tres hypostases, mia does not mean an individual, ousia does not mean substance, tres does not mean a number, and hypostasis does not mean what we usually intend by that. If we forget that, we are missing the point. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Boulnois, for this most lucid paper. I think it takes a great knowledge of the sources and some incisive mind to show successfully, as I think you have done, that Augustine sometimes breaks his own rules when it comes to apophaticism. We will proceed as we have this morning, so I will directly introduce you to our next speaker. Please take notes of whatever thoughts and comments you would raise in response to Professor Boulnois' talk now, and then they can be raised in the Q&A later on. But now, onto Dr. Simone Kotva's paper. I'm delighted to introduce her to you. She is a junior research fellow at Emmanuel College at this university and an affiliated lecturer at the Faculty of Divinity. Her first book on Simone is called Effort and Grace on the Spiritual Exercise of Philosophy, and it will appear next year. And her paper today reflects some of her most recent research on environmental ethics and is entitled Entangled Unthinkably, Trinitarian Ontology as the Key to Ecological Thinking. The floor is yours, Simone.
Do I speak into this at all?
You speak into this.
Okay,
I think this should
great. Can you hear me? No.
It is on, but
It's on. But I don't communicate with this. Right. Okay. Can you hear me now? No. Now? Okay.
it's good.
Better? Yes? Wonderful. Okay, wonderful. So, there is no doubt that the doctrine of the Trinity has had ecological implications in the stories and icons of divine interaction and economy, of getting along and co-creating, for as long as there has been discourse about the nature of God's self. And alongside Christianity and the Trinitarian theologies of Hinduism, the Chaldean oracles and other religious and philosophical traditions. Naturally, such doctrines are held up in a particular way as images of relevance for earth-bound existence, being instances of companionship, of giving and taking, as well as of sorrow, death, violence, and rivalry, in short, of life. Millennia before environmentalism began to worry about ways of modeling effectively coexistence between humans and other than human creatures and things, the Trinity was there with an image that seemed to say it all, human flesh spiraling ecstatically with non-human spirit, getting along. So there are good doctrinal reasons to be excavated for claiming the urgency of the Trinity, or for Trinity analogues, I'll get back to those later on, in a time of planetary emergency, even discounting any special interest in the history of religion. But I think the question about the relevance of the Trinity as an ecological concept and of ecology as an instance of Trinitarian conceptuality has to do with method, as our previous speaker was saying, with ways of thinking, modes of practice and styles of living, of metaphysics. When reflecting on the Trinity, we have to ask, when does speaking and writing about the Trinity, about entanglement, become thinking Trinitarianly? And how does this icon of coexistence actually help, if at all, to get results environmentally, ethically, and politically in the complex planetary life for which the Trinity is supposedly, and so I propose, the lure and sense? Is it possible to think, really attend to, the relationship between the persons of the Trinity, their queer interspecies begetting that seems to refuse joyfully, or the sexual normativity of the human-only world, without living and relating differently to the human-only world, without living and relating differently to the other than human, without, to borrow a slogan from Donna Haraway, finding oneself making kin with other kind, as well as babies with Homo sapiens? This doesn't mean that it's possible suddenly to suspend from the conversation the countless instances when thinking about the Trinity has justified apparent renunciation of the world into which truth was incarnated. I have in mind that recurrent tendency among religious traditions everywhere to confine imitation of the divine life to special communities set apart from the commons and in part depending on the latter's service for their sustainability. Such a one is our own university, of course. God has not always been good news for Gaia. Nonetheless, if theology is still significant today, it is because, and not in spite of, its continued insistence on the ontological entanglement and on the entanglement of ontology which the Trinity bespeaks. It is this continued insistence, both methodological and historical, that I wish to address today. So Catherine Keller, in 2 recent books, Cloud of the Impossible, Negative Theology and Planetary Entanglement, and Political Theology of the Earth, Our Planetary Emergency and the Struggle for a New Public, proposes that the homology between ecological and theological thinking can be traced to both discourses concerned with the other than human, that is also more than us. This is related to feminist psychoanalyst and religious ecologist Luce Irigaray arguments about the homology between mysticism and environmentalism. From the perspective of the human, love for a non-human God is affectively convergent with love for a non-human world, a homology well documented in the lives of saints such as Francis. For many critical theorists today, mystical theology is making urgent ecological sense because it is already profoundly ecological. So Catherine Keller suggests that one of the reasons for the ecological relevance of mystical theology is its habit of thinking about the non-human, about God, in a way that clings to God's self's unthinkability. Now, thinkability has been perhaps one of the thorniest problems and recurrent temptations for ecology, which as a discipline emphasizes the system as a means of comprehending and clarifying non-humans in terms of their functionality. I agree with those theologians and ecologists who do not see that the non-human, any more than the human, can be grasped in this way, for quite aside from oversimplifying the complexity and chanciness of life, it also makes everything that doesn't fit into the system, the model, such as free will, somehow unnatural, with all that free will represents, spirit, the divine and creation, ending up gnostically on the wrong side of the world system. By refusing thinkability to God, mystical theology refuses thinkability also to that which God is linked analogically. In the place of the single system, there is a cascade of entangled relations. There is Trinitarian life. Our task as theologians in what some are calling the Anthropocene is to attune ourselves as best as possible to the unthinkability of God, of which the world is the vestige and trace, to feel the non-humanness of God and the God-likeness of the non-human until we forget eventually whatever it is about ourselves that merits any exceptionalism. At the moment, the world is entangled with God analogues, other than human things and creatures who are treated and viewed as considerably less than divinely non-human. So for this reason, I propose that the divine entanglement celebrated at this gathering become a method of thought, a way of living, and a kind of spiritual exercise, hence the appeal to mystical theology, which Catherine Keller has situated helpfully in the history of apophaticism, in the way of immanence, and negative theology, which Boulnois has explored in his paper and clarified for us. Hence also the largely unthinkable nature of the practice itself, by which I mean not a fantastic or impossible practice, but one whose directives are flexible enough that the mode of thinking at issue always finds a way to be practicable, unthinkable, as in mostly meaningless, when defined and pinned down. I suspect we no longer have time for methods that are good only for specific socio-economic circumstances or separate communities in order to work, which is why those communities, of course, seep into the so-called secular world. Nor do I subscribe to the opinion that mystical theology is inherently or inescapably the method of an elite cadre of adepts. Apophaticism may be a specialized word unfamiliar to most outside this room of adepts, but the hermeneutic that it recommends is a particular way of looking and does not, at bottom, require any book learning. Like ecological thinking, mystical perception is a way of recognizing the non-human and our entanglement with it, specifically through the words we use to speak about God. A recognition that for many, including children, is effortless, a kind of magical thinking. Recognizing this, and then reacting. For only when we're able to act on the matter of the relations revealed will it be possible to make that thinking matter for the planetary entanglement at stake in the present epoch. Every mystical apperception is an ecological exercise in becoming aware of entanglement and then acting accordingly. As Timothy Morton has shown, ecological isn't something one becomes, but something one already is. You are already a symbiotic being entangled with other symbiotic beings. Thinking the unthinkable is difficult in theory, not in practice. As such, it needs to be practiced as well as theorized. If we stop at what is loosely called theory, the whole thing just seems impossible. Among our ecological critics, Timothy Morton showed me that. Among the mystics, it was Simone. There is a passage in one of Weil's unfinished fragments that explains why trying to rationalize the Trinity, she's writing here about paradox, is no good. When we do, she complains, we simply, quote, combine incompatible assertions as if they were compatible. In other words, we smooth out differences. We don't feel the paradox as paradox, feel the difference as difference, the relation as relation. They calls this an illegitimate use of contradiction. The legitimate use, by contrast, she describes like this: accepting two incompatible truths, recognizing them as such, and making of them, as it were, the two arms of a pair of pincers, an instrument for entering indirectly into contact with a sphere of transcendent truth inaccessible to our intelligence. The doctrine of the Trinity is a tool with which we touch indirectly the unthinkability of the entanglement between the human and the non-human. It's a means by which that entanglement is felt, recognized as such. Now, I think we need those feelings, now more so than ever. The Trinity has perhaps often been misunderstood, as if the harmony it depicted were functional compatibility with no admixture of affect, a sort of computer-generated consonance from which overtones and inherent dissonances, color, had been digitally edited out. But that sort of system thinking has no real purchase on a doctrine that encompasses filicide and reproach, any less than it has on the planetary entanglement with which I've been weaving Trinitarian ontology in this paper. It's okay if being entangled makes one shudder and spin. In fact, it's no bad thing. It's okay if the Trinity makes one laugh, weep, jump up and down in rage. In fact, it's desirable. So long as those feelings don't fester, they're a sign of successful reactivation, that those who think about the Trinity are also thinking Trinitarianly, that those who already are entangled are beginning to feel entangled. Now, the Trinity historically offers many icons for getting high. But spiritual ascents aside, and there's plenty of time for that in the afterlife, what's at issue here is deepening, of getting down as well as getting high. The unthinkable isn't waiting at the end of things. The unthinkable presses in on us now, erupts in every newsflash of species extinction and planetary injustice. Why do you stand looking up toward heaven? The end is entangled with the present, heaven with earth. Theology has always understood the Trinity to be strange and unthinkable, a dazzling darkness, but too often that strangeness has been estranged from earthbound life. Yet when the idea of a triune deity first appears in the West, it is as an icon of liminal spaces connected to chthonic realms. I'm thinking here of Hecate, the Greek goddess whose statue was placed at crossroads and whose appearance in later theology was three-personed. In ancient Greece, crossroads were clefts in the road, with one path branching off into two, creating three possible directions, so hence Hecate's three persons. To Hecate, locals would offer katarmata, the garbage, trash, offscorings of any kind, suppers, which were then plundered by the poor and homeless, sometimes by the rebels. It's said that the cynics fill their wallets with Hecate's suppers, and which seemed to be the origin of her connection to the underworld, to death and decay, but also, and by the same token, to that which is rebirthed out of the dirt. In the influential Chaldean theology that emerges around her triple appearance, she is witness to Persephone's abduction and comforter of Demeter, But she is also the one who descends into the underworld, and the mother whose child is lost to death. Together with her role as recipient of kitchen waste, she is mistress of refuse, comforter of the refused, and transformer of earth, the composting psychopomp to whom nothing is excluded, and to whom indeed the excluded matters most of all. How very Trinitarian. For all of this, of course, developed alongside Christianity, and who knows with how much now forgotten interaction and cross-spiritual entanglement with our Trinity. I'm aiming to think Trinity according to the unthinkability which the concept compels me to touch and to get in touch with, albeit indirectly. Evoking a triune earth goddess may seem irreverent at first, but may turn out to make good theological sense. Trinity is a transformation of perception, not one specific story about God, but a way of thinking God that changes how we think everything else for which God is the tug and pull, especially how we think and interact with the created matter we mostly think doesn't matter. It's God becoming a substance. That sort of transformation needs to shake us up at least a bit. 2 decades back, when I first came across the Hecatian Trinity, I was stirred by how it defamiliarized those divine contradictions with which I'd begun to feel sanguinely compatible, even smugly knowing. All the more so as it performed its defamiliarizing work through uncomfortably familiar means. For there is nothing more familiar, or at least there ought not to be, than kitchen waste and refuse. And it was this hint of the divine in the liminal and overlooked that reactivated for me the super-powerfulness of God's relationality and opened a means of making contact with it. Unthinkable entanglement is not accessible only in the wilderness, whether spiritual or physical. A walk down any urban street or visit to the compost heap will give you it in armfuls. It seems to me that the usefulness of an encounter with other than Christian trinities is made possible by the fact that the obvious entanglements, similarities, convergences, whatever, that then appear, give an opportunity to think Trinitarianly the history of the Trinity. That history tangles its own stories, and theology's thinking of an entangled human divine world must be worked through by re-entering the unthinkable complexity not only of earthbound life, but of earthbound life's doctrines and traditions, as real as any compost heap, and of more impressive longevity, which, after all, are theology's principal means of speaking the world she knows. What confident articulations of the unthinkable and unspeakable. Still, to say nothing seemed unfitting, for the nothing that is blank emptiness isn't anything, while the nothing that swells with possibility is the place of future living. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simone, Dr. Kotva, for this wonderful paper and for the reminder, which I think is really important to us here, that we should not just be thinking about the Trinity, but we should attempt to find out what it means to think Trinitarianly. And how about we take 30 seconds to think about good questions now? So for those of you who would like to ask a question, can I ask you 2 things? Please say first your name, and secondly, tell me or tell us which speaker you would ask your question to, and let's try and keep ourselves brief. So, let's begin there.
Thanks to all of you. My name is Eirik Fevang. I have a question for Professor Boulnois. Is metaphysics necessarily without humility? And if one affirms the infinite power of human thinking, does one necessarily deny the reality of sin? Thank you.
the question is not whether metaphysics is or is not deprived of humility. The question is, how do we deal with the only way the Trinity is revealed to us? How do we deal with the Scripture? And the question is, are we projecting our own thoughts? And even an humble metaphysician can project his own thoughts on God. And when you project your own thoughts on God, it is precisely, it is dangerous. I don't say we shouldn't, because we have to, but it is dangerous. And that's why Augustine and other authors remind us to be cautious with these projections, because we must remind what St. Paul says. It's since the people, Romans 1:20, the pagans know God, but this is precisely why they are inexcusable, because they transform God into an idol. So it is very important to be sure that your interpretation of the Bible remains faithful to the core of the meaning conveyed by the text. And it is very dangerous to project into God psychological models, etc. Because I've had to cut this part of my paper because it was too long, but it is very clear that somebody like Feuerbach perfectly understood that, thought he could demonstrate that the Trinity is only a projection of human mind. Because when you analyze the Trinity with memory, intellect, and will, there is a risk to believe that it is really the core of the Trinity. And that's what he believed, because he was a pure Hegelian. And that's why he said that it's a pure mistake. But so it's very important to be careful when we use metaphysical language, and that's what Augustine reminds us.
Thank you both for your papers. My name is Jonathan Bieler. I have a question to Professor Boulnois, and I really like the point you made at the very end, that when in Trinitarian theology we use the term ousia, we don't really mean ousia. What do you think Augustine does when he uses the term substantia and says, in God it has no accidents, on the one hand, and on the other hand it says, in God the three are not three, right? So don't you think that in a way he changes the very definition of the term substantia, more to negating more or less what it could mean in metaphysics? So applying negation to the very terms itself of metaphysics.
This is a difficult point. I would say he half succeeded, and the history has undone what he had done. He half succeeded because he deprived the concept of substance of some of the most dangerous aspects it had for Aristotle. But at the same time, his concept of essence might be re-endowed with metaphysical content, and that's the danger. So I'm sure that for himself he had taken off the virus, but it was not completely, the work was not completely done. So that's why later, 1 century later, not very much more later, Boethius reintroduced some metaphysical concepts in the Trinity.
There was a question by Professor Falk, but I've seen, yeah, thanks.
Thanks. So it's a French, we speak in French. No, I speak in English. Okay. French, speak to a French in English. My question is, behind your text, there is a question, of course, of the overcoming of metaphysics. And as you said, so you said that Augustine doesn't need we don't need this concept of substance, but it seems to me that in the De Trinitate, in fact, first, it's impossible to speak about Trinity outside of the Greek categories, because I think that the meaning of the gesture of Augustine is not to go against metaphysical, but to change it. Because when he took the fourth categories, which is relation, and when he put it at the first place, instead of the substance, he kept the categories. He kept the categories, and that is his force. And I think it is exactly the same when Thomas Aquinas spoke about the subsistent relation in his Summa Theologiae, the question 27, because the subsistent relation in Thomas Aquinas is not a form of substantification, because it is an act. So my question is, if you say that there are dangers, because you are always speaking about dangers, what does it mean, dangers of what? And what is the sense of a Trinitarian ontology if it is to speak outside of ontology? It means that there is no Trinitarian ontology. You have a just Trinity. You see, it is a very big question about the relationship, the link between philosophy and theology, or between theology and culture. Because is there a transformational culture, or do we have to think outside of the categories? So I think that behind your discourse, there is a question. Jean-Luc Marion did exactly the same about Augustine, about substance and essence. So, but can we follow that way?
First of all, I wanted only to remind us that the question is more radical here. The question is that Augustine himself says that we should not use the 9 categories, including relatives themselves. And so this is the principle he defends. But he's not completely consistent with his own principles. And of course, you are right, he tries to overcome and modify the concept of substance, and he tries to modify the concept of relation, and he has to. But the question is he radical enough? The question is, does he propose a counterbalance to this? The question is that. Of course, he modifies the concept. But since he does not completely, he tries to, of course, but he does not completely counterbalance the concept of substance, saying, for example, that we have to overcome any concept of being in the case of God or something like that, it is very easy for the later tradition to reintroduce metaphysics and submit God to our own concepts. It's he gives the weapons for the adversary. So that's why that's only the point I wanted to make.
Now, given that we've had some discussion of Professor Boulnois' paper, I would like to prioritize if someone would want to follow. Is your question to do with? Okay, please then. In front of you, Alex. Yes.
Thank you. So, as promised, I have a question about ecology. The implicit promise in giving a paper about ecology is that it will bear some kind of relation to possible practical action. You don't have to give definite laws or commandments or principles, but the implicit connectability has to be there, I think. Correct me if you think that's wrong. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. And just as a prompt to get things rolling, I've heard essentially 3 approaches discussed in connecting ecological logics up to action. One is to say that we just treat the ecological logic as a means of thinking, as an instrument that we can then use to achieve some ends or other. A second one is that our objective for the time being is to disseminate or spread the ecological form of thought so that when the time is ripe, people will be properly attuned to that way of thinking. And the third one is to not recommend any maxims for action at all, in the sure knowledge that whatever happens, it will be in accordance with the ecological form of thinking that we've endorsed. If any of those sound attractive, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on them.
Did I put this on there?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me? Is that okay? Thank you. Yes, very astute categorization. So I'm not quite sure what you mean by the third option, but yes, there are different approaches to what ecological thinking is. And I suppose when I think of it in relation to theology, I think theology can very constructively critique some of the problems that ecological thinking has, because as I think it was so nice to be in this panel with Professor Boulnois, to show that what we're talking about here isn't a proposition that we adhere to, but it's, as Augustine shows, it's a way of critiquing the limits of pushing further and not settling for comfortably thinking that we have a systematic appraisal of the world and so on, right? The problem with ecology, I mean, this is what I was talking about in the paper, is that it actually tends in the same direction. It tends to systematize and present things as surveyable, so that as long as everyone does something according to some principles, then, you know, everything would be solved. And that's not practicable. This is a kind of never, never land. And it's very dangerous because a lot of ecological thinking is an incantation where you're presented at the end of something that's supposed to soothe you into, it's a sort of cheap paradise idea. As long as you do this, then everything will be great. As long as everyone, you know, you get this sort of cheapified versions in eco-theology as well. If everyone joined so-and-so or lived like this, then we would have a better planet. Instead, we have to have ways of working today, here and now, in the groups that we're already in, how to adapt those communities, how to work within them for the good of, you know, everyone. And I think theology is very good at that because it presents our tools for thinking that make our mind restless, which is also a sort of Augustinian idea. So not to settle for an idea of reality, which then becomes an idol, rather than an icon and living that we enter into. So those are practices, and as you can hear from the way I describe them, they don't translate into rules, as in do this, but what do you have? I mean, the theologian isn't the person who says, and the Trinitarian theologian certainly not, believe this, do this, for only this confers some sort of, I don't know, harmony. But what do you have at your disposal? And how can that become a mode of contacting the divine, right? Ecological thinking is the same because that's what we're trying to do, is think the unthinkable. I don't know if that helps, but yeah. Thanks.
Yes, I'm aware that there are more questions there, but I think actually in some ways coffee breaks are the best places to discuss them anyway. So there is now a half an hour coffee break. There's one piece of information I am pleased to pass on, which is, for those of you who have pre-ordered Andrew Davison's new book on participation, it shall now be available, and even with some extra copies, out there. So thank you so much again to our speakers.